And what I'm seeing now is that part of my purpose is to help make visible the interconnectedness of the issues we face and the web of connection, both in terms of ideas, in terms of disciplines. You know, I'm going to speak at the Parliament of World Religions about women's leadership and climate justice. And then I'm doing a talk for Harvard called Climate Boot Camp. So, you know, there are all kinds of ways that what we know and understand and are learning about the value and the demonstrable value of women in leadership and the need for men to stand with us as allies is more timely than ever.
This show is all about helping you up-level your life, including your well-being, your relationships, your mental health, your wealth, your confidence, and your joy. I challenge you to keep an open mind as together we discover tips, tools, and advice from the experts to help you live life to your fullest potential. Welcome to the Jenna Banks Show. Everyone, thank you so much for being here today. I am Jenna Banks, your host, and I have with me the lovely Nina Simons, who is the co-founder of Bioneers. Bioneers is an innovative nonprofit organization that highlights breakthrough solutions for restoring people and planet. And among other things, their dynamic programs and initiatives focus on game-changing initiatives related to restorative food systems, rights of nature, indigeneity. Oh, that's another one I'm probably going to ask Nina about, but indigeneity. How would you say that, Nina?
Indigeneity.
Indigeneity. That's a new word for me. I love it. Women's leadership and youth leadership. Now, also, Nina has recently released her new book titled Nature, Culture, and the Sacred, A Woman Listens for Leadership. And I am just so honored and privileged to have Nina here with us today. So, Nina, thank you for being here.
Oh, my pleasure, Jenna. And really, increasingly over the years, Bioneers has also focused more and more on othering and belonging, since it's such a critical issue for our social ecology now.
What an amazing array to focus on. It's just so interesting how it's organically come about. When did you start Bioneers, Nina?
Well, my husband and I started it in 1990. And we were doing a company called Seeds of Change at the time, which was a biodiversity seed company. And my husband, who is a journalist, was researching a lot about biodiversity and bioremediation. And what he was finding was that there were amazing people from all walks of life who had solutions modeled on nature, including many indigenous people, of course, who we consider to be the first pioneers. And he was bemoaning the fact to a friend in a hot tub that no one had ever heard about these people, and he thought they were incredible. And the friend said, well, why don't you have a conference? And Kenny said, I've never been to a conference. It sounds boring. Why would I do that? And the friend said, here's a grant, go have a conference. And Kenny came to me because I had a theater background and I had never been to a conference either. So we made it up from scratch according to what we thought would be interesting and powerful and moving and effective. And Bioneers has evolved and evolved ever since. This will be our 35th year.
What an incredible story. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, Bioneers is well known worldwide. You've done some amazing, amazing work. And when I got this book, which came across my desk a few months ago, I was just enthralled. You touch on so many amazing subjects. And just since we're on the subject of Bioneers, before we move on from that, you mentioned something about Bioneers, the difference between Bioneers and pioneers. I found it super fascinating. Can you tell us the difference in your opinion?
Well, sure. In the book, it's actually quoted from Vandana Shiva, who's an amazing food justice activist from India. And what she says is Bioneers are those who know how to work within a whole living system of nature, who understand that as human beings, we're a part of nature, not apart from it. Whereas pioneers are those colonists who come onto a presumably empty land and conquer it. And, so it's really a difference in relational paradigm between a collaborative relationship that is mutual and respectful and mutually honoring, and one that is power over and conquering and destructive.
Which is such a wonderful transition to talking about your book, because it's like one might wonder, how do you connect women leadership, female leadership, which is what the book mostly is about, but it's about many other different things. And how do you connect that to the work that you're doing outside of that? Like, how does it all intersect? And you just talked about it perfectly. Yeah, it's the difference between power over, which is the state we've been in for thousands of years, right?
Yes, which we're reaping irreparable harms from now.
Yeah.
And what essentially could be called a feminist paradigm or an indigenous paradigm, which says we're all relatives. Kenny wrote a poem at the beginning of Bioneers that I still love that says, it's all intelligent, it's all alive, it's all conscious, it's all relatives. And so that's a different way of seeing the world than the way that we've been accustomed to.
Absolutely.
And I think it's all connected. What that speaks to, Jenna, is exactly your question, which is you can't separate women's leadership from climate justice or from food justice or from labor injustice. All of it's connected, or economic or educational. It's all connected. Women, of course, as we know, are 51% of the human population. And the more research that gets done globally, the more that they're proving that as you increase the strength, the education, and the reproductive rights of women, together, those things add up to one of the most effective counterbalances to climate change, among the top three. So, what happened for me was that Bioneers was an amazing education in how it's all connected. And really, for the first years, I was not focused on women's leadership until I saw a film called The Burning Times.
Oh, I read about that in your book. Yes.
Well, if listeners haven't seen it, it's only an hour long. It's a little bit dated, but it was a huge aha moment for me.
Tell us more about that, Nina.
Well, it was made in the early 90s by Canadian women filmmakers. It tells the story of the 300 to 400 year period in European history, which had correlatives all over the world, where somewhere between 50,000 and 5 million women were systematically persecuted and tortured, and many of them burned for the supposed crime of being witches. And to translate that into human terms, part of what that means is that 7 generations of children witnessed as their mothers and aunties and grandmothers and herbalists and midwives were all hunted. And now that science has proven that epigenetic trauma is really a thing, it's become part of my theory about why systems of patriarchy are quite so intractable.
I love that you're bringing this up, epigenetics. So for those who don't know what epigenetics is, there was an interesting study I saw once, and I really don't like recounting something I've only seen once or heard once, but I'm going to do my best. There was a study with rats or mice where one generation, the parents of these baby mice, before the babies were born, they were tortured in some way, shocked in some way, every time they did a particular activity. I believe it was drinking a particular type of liquid, maybe it was water, but they were extremely traumatized by this shocking or whatever that happened. So the next generation that was born, none of that happened. There were no shocks. There was no introduction of any of this, but those same babies avoided whatever that was that caused their parents to be shocked. Now, why is that? Is that epigenetics? Is that basically what you believe happens within us as individuals as we go generation by generation? It's deeply embedded into our genes. We're not even experiencing the burning at the stake anymore, yet we're still dealing with the repercussion in our genes deeply embedded there from generations past, right?
Well, that's what I believe. I would add that in my experience working with Indigenous women and other women of color, there is evidence of epigenetic trauma in so many of them. I mean, and some of it is this unconscious, barely recalled sense of something traumatic. But some of it also is, if you think about Native peoples on Turtle Island whose parents experienced boarding schools, that means that their parents were traumatized in that way. You know, for me, my Jewish ancestors were traumatized by fleeing pogroms in Western Europe. And so I perceive that in my ancestors, in my grandparents, as I believe Native peoples do in their parents and grandparents. And we carry it forward unless we go through a conscious process of seeking to unearth and heal it. What I found, Jenna, a lot of why I wrote the book was because I have been through kind of a 25-year progression of cultivating myself into who I believed I was born to become. And I began that as a result, in part, of seeing the burning times, and also as a result of witnessing how many self-limiting beliefs I had that I had never consciously taken on. And so, you know, a lot of what I talk about in the book is how do we unearth those self-limiting beliefs so that we can really look at them. And one of my great discoveries was about the power of ritual to change ourselves.
Ooh.
You want me to share that?
Yes, please.
Okay. I was in a year-long training called The Art of Change, and the teacher had brought in a guest facilitator who was an amazing Peruvian traditional practitioner who did like an 8-hour-long ceremony. And literally, I think it started at 7 and went on till 3 in the morning.
Wow.
And at 3 in the morning, when we were all kind of like this, he said, if you remember only one thing from our time together, remember this. And it was 9 words of wisdom. And what he said was, consciousness creates matter. Language creates reality. Ritual creates relationship. And those 9 words became like a center post for me as I was co-evolving with my partners a 7-day immersion training for women. And what I found was that when the women would come for this 7-day immersion, even though we had selected them all for their demonstrated leadership, they all arrived saying, oh, I'm not a leader. I don't consider myself a leader. And so what I knew from Bioneers was the earth is calling us all to be leaders now, each in our own way. And if women, by and large, don't consider ourselves leaders, we're in trouble. We need women's leadership so badly.
Yes, we do.
So we started creating all kinds of rituals. And one of the first ones, which I would offer to your listenership, in case they might enjoy trying it, is this. What I found was that cultivating myself towards who I aspired to become was not so easy. That in order to do that, I had to peel away layers of conditioning, often unconscious conditioning. And then I had to create rituals to strengthen that which I was growing myself toward. And so the ritual is this, and you can try it.
Okay. I'd love to hear.
Okay. Either by yourself or with other women. The ritual is, if you're with other women, go round in a circle and say, I am composting this thing that I noticed yesterday that I don't want to do anymore. I'm composting this tendency I have to undervalue my contribution. I'm composting this tendency I see in myself to believe that I'm not enough or not smart enough or not something enough, right? And after going around, and what happens is if you can do it with other women, each woman winds up saying something that's useful to everyone else.
Sure.
Right? And then once you've done that enough, then you go back and you do, and I'm cultivating, I'm putting in the cauldron. Because I'm cooking with it. Yep. I'm putting in the cauldron when I noticed that when I did something well yesterday, I patted myself on the back, metaphorically, right? Or I'm putting in the cauldron how good it felt to receive someone else's praise for a job well done. And I know if your listeners are anything like me, it's not easy to receive people's praise.
Not easy at all. Yep.
Yeah. And what I found, I mean, I've made up dozens of rituals on everything from body image to improving self-worth, and they're all in the book. But what I found was that if I held myself accountable to doing these rituals every day for 6 to 8 weeks, I could perceive a change in myself.
And that is amazing, Nina. Thank you for sharing that, because this, I was going to ask you when you mentioned the ritual part, what does that mean? And you have laid it out so clearly. And there's a lot of women's ERG groups, within corporations out there focusing on how to cultivate more leadership skills, how to, open ourselves up to being leaders, and how to deal with some of these things that hold us back. So this is certainly another tool that we can have in our toolbox to come together as a group and practice some of these rituals of doing away with what no longer serves us. And doing it together, because you talk about that a lot in the book as well, co-creation.
Yeah.
I love that so much, which would be a really great moment for us to talk about that a little bit. Can you talk to us a little bit more about co-creation and how that relates to the feminine energy?
Sure. I mean, part of what I talk about in the book, Jenna, is something that I call relational intelligence. And I think there's more and more evidence coming out across the business and corporate worlds and the governance worlds and all the various sectors that something like 67% of people in the world think the world would be a healthier place if more men led like women. And to me, right?
Yeah.
To me, that relates to the Athena doctrine, which if you don't know, check it out. It's fascinating. And really, I believe that because nature evolved us to be mothers as well as cooks and caregivers and partners and community people, we have a capacity for perhaps a wider breadth of relational skills and sensitivity.
Mm.
Not all women, obviously, but I do think by and large, there's a reason that Hollywood started calling films about relationship chick flicks, which always pissed me off. And, could we have some relationship movies that are for men, please? Because they desperately need it, don't you think?
Did you ever see The Notebook, Nina?
The Notebook?
Yeah, it's a movie called The Notebook. I have to say, I've heard more men referencing this movie than women. And it actually forced me to watch it because I'm like, what is this movie called The Notebook? I thought it was a romance movie that all these men, tons of them, are like, it's one of their favorite movies. So I decided to watch it. And it actually is one of those romance movies that men love somehow. So
wow, how interesting.
It really is very romantic. I was surprised.
Beautiful.
It's a good sign.
The statistics on the state of American men right now is pretty staggering. It's something like, I don't know, 48% of American men have closer relationships in their online relationships than they do in person.
Interesting.
Right. And there's a huge experience of isolation going on in our male populations. And I think it's partly because we have been raised in a relationally illiterate culture, and we have a lot of catching up to do.
I couldn't agree with you more, Nina. And I'm so glad we're on this conversation. I was just talking to someone literally this morning about this idea of reinforcing binaries, which I know you also talk about in the book. Basically, I was just looking at it from a holistic perspective. We as a society, for God knows how long, have really looked at what being a man is as the masculine traits. The masculine traits are a man, and so you are only a man if you do these things. Otherwise, if you're too emotional, too sensitive, too caring, whatever, that's for girls. And then it's chastised, and men are shamed into this almost toxic masculinity kind of way of being. And if you're a woman, that means you have to go all the way into the feminine energy and the nurturing, the caring, the being emotional and all of that, and that there's no in between. And it's forced these binaries upon us, which doesn't seem to be healthy. And there seems to be a backlash against that. How would you describe, the best way, what is a more holistic way for us to be? Because we all have masculine and feminine energy, right? It's really not sane for us to force ourselves into one or the other. It's a yin and a yang, is it not?
Of course it is. And it's one of my favorite conversations in the book is one that I had with Terry Tempest Williams, where she talks about learning to dance with apparent contradictions. And, all of the world's most ancient wisdom traditions described a whole human as a yin and yang combination, as complementarity. And that includes indigenous cultures or most indigenous cultures. And honestly, what I'm advocating for in the book is for us to take an approach toward leadership that I call a full spectrum approach, that says, I want to be able to draw from anywhere on the spectrum of feminine to masculine and anywhere in between, depending on what the current situation asks of me. And, as a human being, that's my birthright, is to have access to all options. And so I think that's part of how we heal the straitjacket that masculinity has become. That and Barbie, of course.
Right. Did you see the movie?
Oh gosh, yes.
Okay, good.
It's quite a piece of art and amazing.
Really, yeah,
it really is.
It's really neat. When I saw it, first off, I had no idea of what to expect. I hadn't seen any of the promotions. I hadn't talked to anyone who'd seen it. So I was blown away. Now, obviously, this is not new information for either of us, but it was so interesting to see this conversation go into the mainstream.
Yeah.
And
apparently,
refreshing.
yes. And apparently it's very popular with women in China. I mean, fascinating. It's global. And, and it's broken every glass ceiling about women directors. Yay, Greta Gerwig.
Yes.
And it's a brilliant collaboration that she made. That's one of the most powerful pieces of social change art I think I've ever seen.
It just blew my mind. I had to go watch it again the next weekend, wherever I could squeeze in a seat because they were impossible to come by.
I
But
know.
yeah. It's actually really exciting to see
Mhm.
that we're in this phase because it opens up the dialogue
Yeah.
for the masses. It's been this, I don't want to say underground conversation, but for those who aren't interested in leadership and culture change and the like, wouldn't be on the forefront of your mind. But when you make it so glaringly obvious, like the Barbie movie did, it is, you can't unsee that.
It's true. And I think I just saw yesterday that in the Harper's Index, 74% of men who were asked don't think that gender equity in the workplace is very important.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Right? So there's a lot of waking up to do.
Yeah.
There's a lot of educating and really, we have allowed ourselves to be sort of mesmerized by a very shallow version of culture that now we need to grow up from.
This is a huge wake-up call, and the work that you're doing really highlights that because you are talking about all the impacts of us being too much in our masculine energy, basically. And it is now at a critical point. The impact on our environment, on our planet is so painfully obvious, especially for the younger generations. They want to know what they can do about it. And I think that everything you talk about in your book highlights changes we can make as a society and within ourselves as individuals.
Yeah.
To start making that change. It's not working, people. It's not working the way that it's been. We need some serious change and it needs to happen quickly. And the first place we can change is ourselves, right?
Of course. Of course.
Yeah.
It's the first thing that actually worked in resolving my marriage was when I realized I could stop focusing on changing him and change me. And everything got better,
So
this is
good.
one of those life lessons. Yeah.
Oh, I'm so glad thank you for being vulnerable with us with that, Nina. It's so true though, right? We have to first focus on healing ourselves.
Yeah.
It starts with us. And then somehow the reflection changes because I've come to learn myself through my years, and more so even recently, that everything is perception. And when we heal ourselves, we heal the perception.
Yeah.
And, through quantum physics, we're understanding more and more about how we do create our reality and that our energy affects everything around us. So we owe it to ourselves and the planet to heal ourselves. I think more and more is coming into the mainstream about healing our trauma, understanding our triggers, understanding how our childhood impacts how we see the world, our perception, our energy. And like you mentioned, you worked on yourself and it healed your marriage. It's helped working on myself has healed my relationships. It's healed so much about what I attract in my world and my life. It all comes down to us. So thank you so much for highlighting that in your book. You cover so much more. I just want to point out to everyone, this is a book chock full of Nina's wisdom. So I highly recommend you go out and get this today. There's a lot of great activities in there, as Nina pointed out, points of reflection, workshops that you can do within your groups to work together on some of these things and reflect and do that personal work. So Nina, thank you so much for being here today. I wish we could have had 2 more hours, but I want to be respectful of your time. But are there any last words that you want to leave us with today?
Well, only to say that as I reflect on myself, I notice that my sense of my calling or my assignment keeps evolving. And what I'm seeing now is that part of my purpose is to help make visible the interconnectedness of the issues we face and the web of connection, both in terms of ideas, in terms of disciplines. You know, I'm going to speak at the Parliament of World Religions about women's leadership and climate justice. And then I'm doing a talk for Harvard called Climate Boot Camp. So, you know, there are all kinds of ways that what we know and understand and are learning about the value and the demonstrable value of women in leadership and the need for men to stand with us as allies is more timely than ever.
Well said,
thank
Nina.
you for that.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate you being here with us today and having this conversation and sharing your wonderful words of wisdom in your book with us. So thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.